I recently got a new job. I'm a 28-year-old guy and I ended up moving to a quiet little mountain town to manage a tea garden. My mom was a little worried that I was going to be alone in this isolated corner of the world, but truth be told, I've always enjoyed the solitude. I had a girlfriend, but we broke up a while ago, and I decided I'd rather be single until someone I was really interested in came along, but the truth is I'm in no hurry. The first Sunday I was there, I went to the tea garden, where a fellow named Wilmer showed me around and took me to the little cabin where I would be staying. It was located on top of a hill, and there was nothing around, just huge mountains and deep valleys. The view from my room was spectacular, and I thoroughly enjoyed pouring myself a cup of tea and sitting there just admiring the scenery and enjoying the aromatic evening breeze. But most of my time was spent exploring the farm and overseeing the things that needed to be done. The days were quite busy, but the evenings were incredibly quiet, with only the wind and crickets chirping and no other noise after the sun went down. The first week passed smoothly, and I began to adjust to my new life alone quite well. But one night, everything changed. I woke up because I heard someone softly humming a song I didn't recognize. I realized it was a woman's voice, sounding in the dark near my cabin. I thought it might be a girl from town, but it seemed odd that she was wandering the hills at that hour, so I just tried to ignore it and went back to sleep. I thought maybe it would be the wind bringing sounds from elsewhere far away. The next day, I finished my work early and decided to go back to do some important paperwork. I walked to the exit of the garden accompanied by Wilmer, who had offered to go with me, since I was still new to the place and didn't know much about it. As we walked through the tea garden towards the exit, I asked him if there were any villages near the cottage. He gave me a confused look and replied that no, there was no one living around there. "But why do you ask that?" Wilmer asked, half amused. I didn't say anything else, I just shook my head and quickly changed the subject, but a few minutes later he asked me again, so I told him. "It's just that one night I heard a girl singing in the valley. From my room I realized that it wasn't really singing, but that she was humming a rather strange tune." Suddenly he got a little uncomfortable and commented something like, "Well, you probably heard some animal howling in the hills, it's normal around here." He stayed quiet the rest of the way, and I went back to my cabin with a curiosity running through my head that I was pretty sure it wasn't an animal, and Wilmer's attitude seemed a little strange to me too. That night after dinner, I decided that if I heard that humming again, I would go out to investigate. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the same humming and female voice again. I walked carefully to my bedroom window. Cold wind and fog covered the entire valley, and the only light I could see was the pale moonlight bouncing off the mountains. Suddenly, something caught my attention. When I looked toward the door, I saw a girl from the village right there. She was looking right into my eyes and smiling, but there was something about that smile that made my hair stand on end. I don't know how long I stood there looking at her, but when she hummed again, she waved for me to come closer, but I didn't. I stayed right where she was and shouted, "Hi, do you need help? Are you okay?" But she didn't respond. She just kept smiling. I could tell she was really beautiful, but there was something about her appearance that seemed, I don't know, enigmatic. She had long brown hair that waved in the wind, and her smile was almost hypnotic. She called out to me again, and this time I couldn't resist, so I left the cabin. When I opened the door, the girl was standing about 5 paces away from me. I immediately felt a cold chill run through me from head to toe. Perhaps it was the icy rush of the early morning, but there was a voice in my head telling me that I should follow her. At that moment, as I stood at the entrance to the cabin debating whether to follow her or not, she let out a giggle that echoed throughout the valley and said, "I'm lost. I'm trying to find my way in the dark. Can you help me?" I couldn't tell her no, so I just nodded. Then in her crystal clear voice she said, "My home is in the valley, I'm scared and I don't want to go alone. Would you walk me there?" I don't know what happened, but before I could answer, my legs started moving on their own. The girl was walking ahead of me, still humming that mysterious tune, and I was following her like a child with her head in the clouds. She walked in such a way that she seemed to float. Her feet barely touched the ground, but suddenly she stopped singing. Then my heart skipped a beat as I realized that instead of a house, we were approaching the precipice of the valley, and there was nothing but a chasm of at least 50 meters and a very unstable rocky edge that crumbled easily. And now we were dangerously close to it. I understood that if I followed it like that, I might fall from a deadly height and no one would ever know about me. "Where are you taking me?" I shouted, feeling panic take over my body. Who was this woman and where was she taking me, because clearly, her house was not down this path. At that moment she stopped and turned to me, but then I stood rigid as a statue. Her once beautiful face was now distorted. Her eyes were bulging out of their sockets and her skin was now torn and decayed, bones showing. It was like looking at a rotting corpse. At that moment I felt my heart freeze. I became immobile and completely mute. I couldn't process what was in front of my eyes, and for an instant I felt like I was going to faint. She started to laugh in a creepy voice and approached me, who was still immobile in the same place, grabbed my hand with her bony and icy fingers, and it was only at that moment that I could react and started to scream and try to let go, but she wouldn't budge and started to pull me towards the edge of the cliff. I screamed, struggled, and did everything I could to try to free myself from that specter's grip, but it was useless, and when I was only a few steps away from the edge of the abyss, I understood that my end was near. We were about to fall when suddenly someone grabbed my neck tightly from behind and I felt myself faint. In the midst of the confusion, my vision began to darken and I completely lost track of the world. When I regained consciousness, there was Mr. Evans beside me, the owner of the plantation and also the town doctor who was taking my pulse. I woke up startled and looking everywhere, terrified that the spirit from hell might still be around, but Mr. Evans told me to calm down, that it was all over and that the spirit was gone. That day he explained to me that what I had seen that night was a ghost that was well known in town. It was the spirit of a young woman who had thrown herself off that cliff after the man she loved and was going to marry abandoned her and married another woman. That happened more than 90 years ago, but since then, her ghost has been haunting the area, trying to lure men into the valley and make them fall off the cliff. It is believed to be her way of getting back at the men for what her fiancé did to her. Wilmer told me you had heard her singing and I thought you might fall into her trap, so I came looking for you last night to warn you. I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner, she said. I didn't answer him right away, I just nodded and thanked him, but as soon as I felt better I talked to him and quit the job. He understood, and that same day I packed my things and went back to my hometown. I will definitely never go back to this cursed place again, but the melody that infernal girl hummed still echoes in my mind every night. My wife and I had recently moved to a small but prolific town in Texas. Laura was the head of a small and growing tech company while I was a simple school teacher. She obviously made a lot more money than I did, but the truth was that we were in a very happy relationship and I didn't mind that she was the one bringing home most of the income. I'm not that kind of macho guy who resents that his wife is more successful than he is, although it did bother me that she often seemed very stressed. She was always pushing herself to grow her business and be more competitive in the marketplace. In the last quarter, her company had been incredibly successful. They even acquired another small company, which was challenging, but ultimately very profitable. During a meeting with the shareholders, Laura was able to share the good news with them and they were all very pleased with her management. After presenting to the investors, she came home in a great mood, so I decided it was a good idea to take her out to dinner to celebrate. I'm not a fan of fancy restaurants, but I knew she was fascinated by them, so I ended up taking her to a Mediterranean place I had heard good reviews about. We sat at a table in the back, and before the food arrived, Laura started telling me all about her day. She was really amazing, and I was glad she was doing so well in her business. She worked very hard and deserved every accomplishment. Dinner was great, but during the evening, I noticed that a gentleman was watching us insistently from across the place. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a while I felt uncomfortable. I interrupted Laura and told her to look to her left, but when she did, the man was no longer there. I decided not to worry about it and we continued to enjoy our dinner. When the bill came, I tried to pay, but Laura wouldn't let me. We thanked the waiter and left the restaurant, heading home to rest and get ready for a new day. But when we got to the parking lot, Laura yelled, "What the hell is this?" I didn't know what she was talking about until I saw what she had seen. Our tires were flat. It was as if someone had stuck a knife in each one. At that moment, I remembered the guy from earlier. There was something strange about him, although I had no proof. I told Laura that I suspected he had been responsible for slashing the tires, and she reacted frightened and asked me to describe the guy. I was a little surprised by her reaction, but I told her he was tall, thin, half-bald, and bearded. Her reaction was one of surprise. "Oh God, I know who he is." I asked her who it was, but she didn't answer, instead telling me to call a tow truck right away. I tried to ask her if I shouldn't call 911 first, but she shouted no. I wanted to know more about this guy, but she wouldn't give me any more details. Finally, the tow truck arrived, changed our tires, and we returned home. We had just moved into our new house a few days ago, a place Laura bought after her company made that big acquisition. When we first arrived in this town, we had acquired a fairly modest little house, but after Laura's company made this big new leap, she bought this new house, which was much bigger and nicer than we really needed, especially since we weren't planning on having kids, but still, the place was great, very quiet and secluded. As we walked in, Laura closed the door, and I noticed she was still nervous about what had happened with the tires, but she wouldn't tell me anything about the guy who was harassing her. That night, we decided to go to bed early, but I couldn't rest. I had horrible nightmares, so in the end, I stayed up most of the night. The next day, Laura went to the office as usual. I stayed home because my students were on spring break, so I spent my time doing household chores while thinking about that bearded stranger in the restaurant. I was still very intrigued by the fact that Laura hadn't wanted to tell me anything about it, but I felt she had too much stress and I didn't want to push her even harder, so I hoped she would tell me herself when she was a little calmer. I went out to get the mail, but when I opened the mailbox, I was met with a grisly scene. A dead bird with a knife sticking out of its stomach was inside. I was shocked. I felt a shiver run through my body at the sight. What is all this? Who is behind this siege and why? What is Laura not telling me? All these questions were swirling around in my head at that moment as I ran back to the house to call my wife. When I told her what I had found, she was very quiet on the other end of the line. But I couldn't keep up the intrigue. I needed to know what was going on and who was behind it. I begged Laura to tell me who was behind it and what it all meant. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to explain everything. It turns out that the company they had acquired was not willing to sell. It was a hostile takeover, and the man she had described to me was one of the owners, who hated the idea of losing his business. This man had already threatened her, but she didn't think he would actually do anything against her. Now it all clicked. Laura just wanted her business to prosper, and it wasn't fair that she had to deal with that. I told her I was going to call the police, but again she yelled at me that I was not. That attitude made me think she was hiding something else from me, but I decided to trust her and not argue. After the call, I set about securing all the doors and windows in the house, feeling a little calmer doing so. At least no one would be sneaking into our home in the middle of the night, or so I thought. The days passed without incident. Laura and I avoided talking about it and tried to normalize our lives. But then, Friday of the following week came. She was in her office and I had gone to the farmer's market. When I got home, I put all the groceries away and put them in the refrigerator without thinking much about it. However, as I closed the refrigerator door, I realized that something strange had happened. All of our photos were shredded, and my wife's face was scratched on every one of them. This meant that the stalker had broken into our house. My heart raced and I ran to where I had left my phone. But before I could reach it, the bearded guy jumped out of a closet and caught me. I froze on the spot. The man had a deranged look in his eyes and looked desperate. "Please don't hurt me," I said, too scared to defend myself. He just hit me hard and I fell against the kitchen island, slumping to the floor. I tried to get up, but the guy kicked me in the face and I immediately felt one of my teeth give way. As I struggled to stay conscious, I saw the man lean over me with a knife in his hand. "What do you want?" I said desperately, almost stammering the words because of all the blood that was pouring out of my mouth. "You and your wife are monsters," he spat at me. "What are you talking about? What are we supposed to have done? Look, we don't know you, and as far as I know, none of us have assaulted you in any way," I replied, trying to calm him down. But then he explained to me that he and his mother had founded their company 10 years ago, after his father's death, and when Laura had tried to buy it, they had refused. The guy started ranting about how successful the company was and how happy he and his mother were with what they were doing. But then he mentioned something that surprised me. He said that Laura had sabotaged his products, that she had paid others to harass his team and had cast aspersions on the internet about his company. He said that because of that, so much fuss was made that he and his mother were forced to sell their company at a price that was far below its value. "No way," I protested, feeling horrified. "She would never do that." Then he shouted at me, holding the knife so close to my face that I feared to move. Your wife is a con artist. She stole millions from us, bribed officials to throw a mortgage on my mother's house, and then bought it. He was referring to the house where we were living. At that moment, my mind began to spin and I felt very dazed. But that wasn't all. Just when I thought it couldn't get any more horrible, he told me that his mother had suffered a heart attack shortly thereafter, a product of all the stress Laura had caused him with her actions. If what this man was telling me was true, it explained why his obsession with us, with Laura especially. I was in front of a man who had lost everything, his company, his home, and his mother. He told me that when he saw us having dinner and laughing in that restaurant with $300 food, he was furious, and that's why he slashed the tires of our car. Now his look was completely wild, but for some reason I believed him. Laura was a great wife, but the truth is she was a real bitch when it came to doing business. She was a very ambitious woman and never stopped when she wanted to get something. However, I never thought she was capable of so much. Now I was questioning everything. It was possible that everything we had accomplished could have been built on her wrongdoings. That explained why she was telling me not to call the police. At that moment, the man turned his gaze back to me again. His face changed to an expression of pure anger, and then I knew what was coming. But just as he raised the knife to give me the final blow, he stopped. Something in his gaze changed, and the hand with which he held the knife began to tremble. Then he withdrew from on top of me, dropped the knife, and sat down on his side with his knees bent and his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said to me, almost sobbing. It was clear he was having a mental breakdown, but at that moment he seemed to realize that I had nothing to do with the misfortunes that had marked him. It was all Laura's fault. Then he turned to me, and I thought he was going to attack me again, but instead he helped me to my feet. My heart was still pounding in my throat, but I think my disappointment was even stronger. "Will you help me?" he asked. I knew immediately what he was talking about. He wanted revenge on Laura. I thought about it for a moment, but I would never want to hurt my wife. However, if there was any truth to what the guy was saying, she would have to face the consequences of his actions. "No," I replied. "I can't help you, but I won't stop you either." He smiled at my response, turned, and walked away. After that, I went to the dentist for emergency surgery. It wasn't too terrible, but when I returned home, I was left waiting for Laura to come back. I had to tell her everything, and I needed her to give me an explanation. But she never came home. Later, the police found her car in the office parking lot, but Laura wasn't there. When I was informed, my nerves were shot. I was very scared and fearing the worst. Over the next few days, a search operation was organized to find Laura, but she never showed up, nor did the guy with the beard. However, a month later, a letter arrived anonymously in my mailbox. In it, there were about 5 photographs, and in each one you could see Laura, but now with short blonde hair, wearing dark glasses, and completely different clothes from the ones she used to wear. She looked like a different person. The pictures were dated 2 days ago, and the place where she was looked like another country. Behind one of the photos it said, "Don't look for her, she is fine, but she can never come back because if she does, she will go to prison for life." This left me very shocked, but at the same time I was very relieved that she was alive, because I was really convinced that the man had murdered her and buried her body in some remote place. However, I decided to take heed. After all, I now knew that I didn't know the woman I married at all, and I had planned to ask her for a divorce anyway. Finally, I ended up selling everything, leaving the house and moving to a smaller, cheaper place. I had no idea what had become of the guy with the beard, but I just hoped he would stay away from me forever, just like Laura. I'm a cattle farmer in a small Midwestern town, a pretty out-of-the-way and almost God-forsaken place, but this is where I was born and raised. Not that it's the most wonderful and glamorous job in the world, but it's what I have on hand. And with how complicated it is to find a decent-paying job these days, and even more so in a town like this, I've learned to value it. My day-to-day consists of basically cleaning and feeding the cows, plus checking their hooves, milking them, and helping them give birth when necessary. At first it may seem like a total mess, but over time I've gotten used to it. In fact, I don't even mind the smell like I used to. I remember in the beginning it was almost unbearable, but now it's like I don't even notice it. This farm was my dad's before me and my grandfather's before him. The story I want to tell you is about my old man. He told it to me when I first started working here. It was kind of a lesson on what not to do when caring for animals in the field. This happened decades ago, so he is no longer with us, but this story has haunted me for years. So I decided to share it and let others judge it as they will. Back in the 1970s, my dad was in his early 20s and was working on the farm with his dad. My grandfather's name was Bob. Back then, Dad hated it. I mean, not my grandfather, but the farm work. He hated the stench, which only got worse when the summer heat came, and worst of all was picking up what the cows left behind after eating. The cows were stuffed into a huge shed, which was more like a giant warehouse where they were fed and kept all year round. During the day, they would go out to graze, but at night, they would simply drop their droppings on the concrete floor. Every morning when the cows went out to the field, my dad would grab a long hose and drag the waste to a pit that led to a huge tank under the shed. That tank was filled with all the stuff they accumulated, and once a week a guy would come by to empty it. It wasn't glamorous at all, but my dad did that job like a champ. One day, my grandfather got tired of doing all the work between him and my dad, so they decided it was time to hire someone else. Weeks went by without finding anyone interested in the job, until Dad met a guy at the local grocery store, a guy named Alfred. He was a guy in his early 20s like my dad, and seemed thrilled with the idea of working here. Alfred hadn't had a job for quite a while, and was anxious to get a paycheck because his wife was expecting their first child. So my grandfather hired him on the spot at the grocery store, and the next day, as soon as the sun was up, there he was, out on the farm, working harder than anyone my dad had ever seen. He was a guy full of energy and with an immense desire to eat up the world. He was always running around fixing whatever was needed and trying to learn every little detail about the job. You could tell he loved what he did, so much so that he told everyone about it, convinced that he wanted to be a good worker to earn his bread and butter. He believed to the death in hard work and that everyone should get what they deserve. My dad was glad to have Alfred by his side, not only because he worked hard, but also because he was quite naive and easy to handle. My grandfather's strategy was to give my dad certain chores throughout the day, and he, instead of doing them, would pass them on to his new partner. Alfred didn't mind because he had no idea he was being used, and it suited my dad just fine since it meant he could get away from the things he hated so much. About 4 months went by like that, and my old man even began to find it a little funny that Alfred did everything he was told with such goodwill. But then, one hot summer morning when the cows were already out grazing, my grandfather asked Dad to water all the droppings into the pit at the end of the barn, as he always did, but instead of doing that, Dad shifted the task to Alfred and sat down on the side of the shed to smoke a cigarette. When he finished, he went out all excited to tell my dad that he had come up with a great idea for the farm. He proposed that if he emptied the tank under the shed himself, they could use the feces as fertilizer on the crops, and that would make the plants grow bigger and faster. My dad, at first, thought Alfred's idea was silly, but then his mind lit up and he decided it would be fun to see if he really dared to do that, so he agreed without saying anything to my grandfather, knowing he would have objected immediately. I just wanted to watch this madness unfold. My dad showed Alfred how the drain valve worked and instructed him to empty the tank into some large barrels. He also warned him to be careful and not to turn the valve too fast, otherwise it might get stuck, and they would have to call someone to fix it. After that, Dad decided to leave the boy alone with his homework and take a walk around the barn to check that everything was in order. What my old man didn't know at the time was that Alfred would end up turning the valve too fast, causing a big problem. When the guy opened the tank, he reached into the mud in an attempt to clear the line. But suddenly my dad started hearing screams coming from the barn and ran to see what was going on. As he peered into the tank, he froze. Alfred had fallen into that huge 5,000-gallon container that was full of waste that hadn't been emptied all week, and now he was trying not to drown in the thick sludge of cow manure. When my dad got to the edge of the tank, all that could be seen was Alfred's hand poking through that foul brown slurry. He tried to grab it and pull it out, but there was nothing to lean on. So doing his best, he managed to lift it up a little, and it told him that he was only trying to fix it because he knew it was going to cost them extra money. Dad felt bad about what he had done, so he told him to hold on a little longer until they could get him out. But in the blink of an eye, his grip failed, and the boy sank back into the thick excrement. This time, there was nothing left to grab. Alfred had vanished. My dad started to panic, not knowing what to do, so he ran off to find my grandfather, who wasted no time in calling the police. But when they returned to the tank, the boy's hand was no longer in sight, and my dad and grandfather had no choice but to wait for a miracle to happen, but that was highly unlikely. After a few minutes, the police arrived along with the fire department, and they didn't know where to start either. Finally, they came up with a plan and pulled out a metal pole with a loop at the end. When they managed to rescue Alfred, the situation was heartbreaking. The look on my dad's face was one of complete horror. He knew this was his fault. Although he knew it was not a good idea to let Alfred do that, let alone by himself. He thought it would be entertaining to see what happened, but now he realized he could have stopped him. But his arrogance and laziness got the better of him. When my dad told my grandfather what had really happened, my grandfather was very angry, but most of all very disappointed, because his selfish attitude and taking advantage had cost the life of an honest and hard-working person like Alfred. Alfred's wife gave birth soon after, and my dad, due to his great burden of conscience, supported her financially with his son and everything, until she finally remarried a couple of years later and moved to the city with her new partner. Since then, my dad made it a point to honor Alfred's memory by working as hard as he did every day of the rest of his life, carrying that guilt that never left him. So much so that when my old man passed away in 2016, the last thing he said to me was that I should never take advantage of anyone, much less if they were a good person. My name is Alex, and I'm an investigative journalist for a pretty famous magazine that specializes in urban legends and all things weird and paranormal. One day, my boss called me into his office and told me about a place I definitely had to check out, the mansion of a guy named Killiam Cavani, which was in a little town outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This man, now in his late 60s, had been living alone since his older brother, Loris Cavani, passed away more than 30 years ago. He was said to be the only one left of his family, which had lived on the estate since the 19th century. The place had a bungalow at the back of its grounds, but no one had been near there in years, not even Killiam himself. The reason is that they say that place was haunted. But what happened there? Why is it believed to be haunted? I asked my boss. You see, Loris Cavani, the eldest Cavani, shot himself in that bungalow, he told me, and neighbors claim that his ghost still haunts there, haunting even Killiam himself. For this reason, my boss told me he needed me to write an article about it based on my own experience. Ready for the adventure? He asked me. Of course I was. I was always up for any challenge my job threw at me, and this one seemed pretty interesting. By Monday of the following week, I was suitcase in hand, ready to hit the road. As soon as I stepped out of the airport, I saw a guy in a suit waiting at the entrance. This one approached with a big smile and introduced himself as the chauffeur for Cavani Manor. Welcome, sir. Mr. Killian is waiting for you at his house. Follow me, please. I got into the car while he lit a cigarette. And what is your name? I asked him. I'm Mr. Leonard, but you can call me just Leonard. Make yourself comfortable. It will take us about 2 hours and 25 minutes to get to where Mr. Killian lives, so you'd better relax and enjoy the scenery. We started driving through town, and I was excited to see the dark woods. As the sun began to set, the cool wind filled my face. Leonard was right. It took us about 2 hours to reach the town, and the scenery transported me as if to another era, that time of Gothic atmosphere reminiscent of medieval times. After going through a long road full of curves and surrounded by trees and mountains, we finally arrived at the Cavani mansion. It was already getting dark at that time, and when I looked at my watch, it was 5:15 p.m. The mansion was in a rather secluded area of the village, but it was situated on a hill, so it could be seen from some distance. It was a sight to see this place from afar, as it was huge and gave that haunted castle vibe that was creepy and beautiful at the same time. When we got out of the car, a tall guy with white hair and a spiky combed mustache was standing by the big door of the mansion smoking a pipe. Next to him was a man in uniform who I quickly deduced must be his butler or something similar. The aroma of freshly lit tobacco hung in the air. Leonard had stopped the car right in front of him, so I got out and the guy approached with a smile. Welcome, sir. I'm Killian Cavani, the owner of this estate. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Mr. Cavani. You can call me Alex, I said. He nodded and invited me in. The first thing that caught my attention was that the man looked quite replenished for his age. He was in good shape and was a rather elegant and good-looking man. On the other hand, the place was gigantic. The hallways were decorated with huge paintings and antiques that would cost a fortune. I went with Killian to the living room, and we sat on a velvet piece of furniture that looked expensive, like everything else in the mansion. A servant brought us wine, and Killian said to me, "Dinner will be ready in a moment. I have prepared the guest room for you. Make yourself at home, Alex." I thanked him for the hospitality. After such a long trip, I was already feeling tired, so I decided to go to my room after dinner and put my ideas to Killian the next day. I had never seen a table so full of delicious dishes. That was enough to feed a king and his entire court. There was grilled chicken, roast pork, freshly baked bread, plenty of salads, fish, and desserts. Everything tasted amazing. I was very hungry, so I helped myself to what I could, and from what I could tell, Killian also enjoyed good food. After dinner, I thanked him again for the invitation and retired to my room. The room was a special place in itself, with a huge fluffy bed and a couch by the window overlooking the hills. The place felt nice and cozy, so I put on my pajamas, and as soon as I fell into bed, sleep quickly won me over. When I woke up, I had a little trouble remembering that I wasn't in my messy little apartment. I opened the windows of my room, and the view of the valley, surrounded by mountains, left me speechless. A servant came to tell me that Killian was waiting for me in the living room and that breakfast was ready. When I arrived in the dining room, I saw my host drinking tea and smoking his pipe. I couldn't believe how healthy he was smoking like that. "I hope you slept well, Alex," he said to me. "I slept amazing. This place is so peaceful," I replied with complete honesty. I couldn't agree more. But if you decide to live here, you might start to feel a little paranoid with so much silence. "So ask me anything you need to know for your article," Cavani told me, as he invited me to try the food. I helped myself to buttered toast, and after a moment's reflection, decided it was time to ask. "So, what happened to that bungalow you have in the woods? Is it really haunted or what?" Cavani sighed a little. "Well, I haven't seen anything weird personally, but after my brother's death, people in the village started saying that they heard strange noises inside at night, as if someone was there. But the truth is that since that happened, I stopped going to that place. I only check it in the morning once every 6 months, if at all. The truth is, I don't feel like venturing out there after dark." "Can I ask you how your brother died?" I said carefully. "It was a tragic accident. My brother Loris lost his mind before he died. Truth be told, I don't know exactly what happened to him. He became mentally unstable. I tried to get him to see a doctor, but he went into that bungalow and didn't come out for months. One morning, I sent Leonard to see what was wrong because I hadn't seen him in a while. He came back with the devastating news that he had committed suicide. He shot himself 3 nights before, and none of us knew about it. He was someone with a strong character. If anyone tried to meddle in his life, he would get very angry, so we had to give him his space. No one dared to argue with him. He was a complicated guy with a tormented mind. It still hurts me that I wasn't there for him." "I'm sorry for making you relive those moments," I replied apologetically. "Don't worry about it, it's okay," he told me. At that point, I took the opportunity to ask his permission to stay that night in that bungalow, and explained that it would help me better prepare my article. "Well, no problem. If nothing bad has happened there so far, I can't deny you that," Killian replied with a shrug. After breakfast, I got some fresh air and decided to go sightseeing around the grounds. I knew I had to get to the bungalow before sunrise, as people don't dare approach there after dark so earlier at about 5 p.m. I set out on this adventure that had me more excited than I had anticipated. The bungalow was not close to the mansion as I had expected, but rather quite out of the way, almost reaching the edge of the back of the estate, but there was a cobblestone road through the woods leading there. As we traveled, I asked Leonard, "Mr. Cavani told me that you were the first one to find Loris's body, wasn't that right?" "Yes, that was a horrible scene," he replied, and his expression became serious. Mr. Loris was sitting in his chair with his arms spread wide and his face full of blood. There was blood everywhere, on his clothes, on the floor, and his brains were sizzling on the back wall. The revolver was lying on the floor. It was really terrible. Leonard closed his eyes in horror, and I decided I didn't want to know anymore. The fog was already beginning to cover the road, and by the time we reached the bungalow, the darkness was total. The howling of wolves mixed with the chirping of crickets created the perfect atmosphere for a horror movie. "Take care of yourself, sir. I'll be back for you tomorrow morning," Leonard said before leaving. I stood in the doorway watching the car drive away until it vanished into the fog. Then I decided to go inside. Moonlight filled the bungalow, giving it an almost mystical air. Then I entered what was Sir Loris Cavani's last abode and took a seat in a chair near the window. From there I had a view of the dark valley stretching out before me, lit by the bright night sky. It was beautiful and gloomy in equal measure. I lit a cigarette, and taking the first puff, my eyes fell on a table across the room. Next to it was a wooden chair. Surely it was the same one in which Loris Cavani had taken his life. I'm not going to lie, I got a very intense shiver down my spine as I looked at that spot. I could imagine the scene that Leonard had described to me, and it really seemed kind of creepy. Minutes passed, and despite all the rumors, nothing strange happened. I began to think that maybe it was all just hearsay. I closed my eyes, and although I didn't know exactly what time it was, I had the feeling that it was already past midnight. The silence was overwhelming, but suddenly I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was outside the room. I didn't want to turn on the light, but the moonlight was enough to see the contours of the room. The door was barely ajar, and in a matter of seconds I saw a man approaching. "Who's there?" I asked, feeling a knot in my stomach. "You dare to ask?" he replied in a mysterious voice. "I'm sorry, Mr. Loris. I didn't expect you to come back." I was filled with panic, but I tried to remain calm because I needed to know the truth. As a paranormal investigator, I deal with these types of situations all the time. I know there are many skeptical people, but believe me, ghosts manifest more often than you would imagine. And even more so when they have departed this world in such violent situations, they just choose who to contact. And for some reason, I am one of those people that spirits are usually attracted to. Let's just say that's the main reason I do what I do, but it doesn't take away from the fact that I feel the same fear that any of you do when faced with an otherworldly being. "Why did you kill yourself?" I asked him directly. "Because of something that was tormenting me in my life. I couldn't go on anymore, so I left this place. But this place is beautiful and full of calm and quiet," I replied. "I am at peace here. I don't blame anyone for what happened to me," and suddenly the voice stopped. I stood up and started walking towards the door where the shadow of who I thought was Loris was standing. But as I got closer, I could clearly make out the person who was there. "William, what are you doing here?" But before I could finish, I realized that Killian was shaking. His face was white and his gaze was fixed. I looked over to where he was looking and froze. Right on the couch, the one where I assumed Loris had taken his life, was a man. His face was covered in blood. One of his eyes was hanging out of his eye socket. The top half of his head was missing and his brains were spilling out that side. It was horrible, really horrible, the most shocking thing I've ever seen in my life. I had seen ghosts before, but none that had materialized as vividly and eerily as Loris Cavani was doing at that moment. "You killed me, liar," he screamed in a voice that would make anyone tremble. "You drugged me for days and told people I was crazy, but you only wanted the family inheritance and couldn't control your greed." At that moment, Killian was still petrified. He was absolutely certain that this was the first time he had encountered his brother's ghost. Surely he didn't even think that was possible. "I'm sorry, Loris," Killian said in a whisper. His voice barely came out in a trickle. "I didn't mean to kill you. Please forgive me. Let me go." At that instant, I turned to Loris and asked, "What happened, Loris?" There was silence for a few seconds, but then the ghost spoke. "That night you came into this cabin while I was unconscious from the pills," he began, clearly addressing Killian. "You placed me in the chair and shot me. Then you covered up your crime like it was a suicide, you murdering bastard. I was waiting for you to muster the courage to come here and face me. Who will save you now?" At that moment, Charles started screaming and tried to run out of the bungalow, but something invisible stopped him, leaving him paralyzed right at the edge of the door. Suddenly, he started walking backwards into the room, and when I looked at him, I realized that his face was one of absolute panic. His eyes were wide open and he was opening and closing his mouth in search of air, as if he couldn't breathe. At the same time, he was trying to remove something from his throat. It was as if an invisible force had grabbed him by the neck and dragged him inside, preventing him from escaping and suffocating him. Suddenly, I turned to look toward the couch, but Loris was no longer there. However, I couldn't see him attacking his brother either. Killian kept backing away until he fell down, sitting on the couch where his brother's ghost was a few moments ago. And what happened next, I can only describe as the most terrifying thing I have ever witnessed in my life. Killian suddenly took a huge gulp of air, like someone who is submerged underwater and suddenly comes to the surface. But then, his eyes and mouth opened disproportionately in the most terrifying expression of terror I have ever seen. and he began to scream in a blood-curdling manner over and over again, clutching his head tightly in his hands, as if he was experiencing excruciating pain. A couple of times he tried to get up from the chair, but something prevented him, and he fell back on his back in the same place. His screaming continued for several minutes that seemed like hours to me, while I stood in the corner of the room watching in horror. Killiam's screams were desperate, and I wanted to be able to do something to help him, but I knew I could not. Whatever was happening to him was completely out of my power and out of this world. Suddenly, the man let out one last piercing scream before his body went limp on the couch, but with his eyes wide open and the same expression of terror tattooed on his face. At that moment, all was silent, and the room seemed to clear. It was as if all the terrifying energy that had pervaded it since Loris's ghost manifested itself had suddenly dissipated. All that could be heard was the sound of crickets, and without any explanation, or at least not an earthly one, there was a kind of sense of peace and relief that filled everything. To me, it was clear. The tormented spirit of Loris Cavani had finally gotten his revenge, and now he was finally gone. Where to? I don't know, but I was no longer trapped in the bungalow. When the storm passed, I approached Killiam and checked his pulse so I could corroborate that he had indeed passed away. To make a long story short, I told Leonard, and he called 911. He asked me what had happened, but I just said that he had collapsed on the couch. If I told him the truth, he wouldn't believe me. After he was moved, the doctors found that the cause of death had been a stroke. I must say that in all my years as a journalist and investigator of paranormal events, the case of Killiam and Loris Cavani has been the one that has shocked me the most so far. Never in my life had I seen a spirit manifest itself with so much fury and so much rancor. I have never seen an entity pierce the veil between the world of the living and the dead in such a powerful way. I only hope that when it is my turn to pass to the other plane, I will never run into any of the Cavani brothers. My name is Andy, and I'm an 18-year-old boy from a small town in Ohio, and this all happened about 2 years ago. Everyone knows everyone here, and for the most part, nothing too weird or creepy ever happens, although there are a couple of meth addicts and some alcoholics hanging around, but nothing else. Next door to my house is a cool little house that was renovated and looks pretty nice. Eventually, some guys from California moved in. After about a month, they finally decided to show up while my band and I were rehearsing in the garage. The husband's name was Mike, and his girlfriend was Lisa. They were pretty cool, very friendly and laid-back people, if you know what I mean. They told us that they liked to hang out and talk about the concerts they had been to. They were even bragging to us about seeing Linkin Park at their last concert with Chester in England. The truth is that we liked them and enjoyed chatting with them. Mike used to come over to help us whenever he saw us unloading groceries or furniture, but over time we noticed that his behavior became a little strange. One day, he came over to help us load a washing machine, and he was awfully weird, very quiet and nervous, barely exchanging words with my mom. One night, my friends and I were in the garage trying to write music with all the doors closed, when suddenly we heard Mike and Lisa having sex in their backyard. Normally this might have been a funny anecdote, but the sounds they were making were truly frightening. It wasn't the typical noise that normal people make. This sounded more like a demonic growl mixed with a weird screeching noise. We all felt uncomfortable and decided to go back to concentrating on our music and try to ignore the whole thing. We had definitely already started to notice that they weren't behaving like they had at first, but that's when things started to get really, really dark. One night, it was already around 11 o'clock, and I went out to my car to grab something I had forgotten earlier. As I rounded the corner to my house and went to unlock the car, the lights illuminated the garage, and there he was, Mike, standing right in front of the door, looking at me with an expression I couldn't even decipher. When the lights went out, I froze and blurted out, "Hey, what the hell, buddy? What are you doing in our driveway?" He replied in a slow, slurred voice, as if he'd had one too many. "I was just checking, just in case there were intruders," he told me. That way of speaking gave me a bad feeling, or rather a bad feeling. I wouldn't know how to explain it, but it was like something was definitely not right with him that night, so I said, "Look, you really need to leave, this isn't right." But instead of leaving, he started begging me, "Please don't tell Lisa. She's going to be mad, I'm scared." Suddenly he stopped talking, turned around and walked calmly home, like it was nothing. The next day I decided I had to talk to Lisa about what had happened, so I went to her door and knocked, hoping she would answer. But nothing. No one showed up, and I didn't see them for at least a whole week until something else strange happened. One night I was lying in bed talking on the phone with my girl when I started hearing banging on the walls. I didn't freak out at first. I thought it was my mom in the next room telling me to shut up, so I hung up and went to check. Turns out my mom was sound asleep, so I asked her if it had been her and she said no. That's when the panic started to rise. I ran back to my room, and as I looked out the window I saw a black figure, a guy standing there at the back door. I jumped into my room, grabbed my caliber rifle and went out to look, but when I did, no one was there. Now I was confused and scared, so I walked over to the front door and looked through the peephole. And what do you think? There was Mike, standing right on the other side, staring at me like I was a statue. After a while he ducked down and I didn't see him anymore. I told my mom to call the police, but by the time they got there he was gone. I went straight to Mike's house and knocked on the door for several minutes, but nothing. No one answered. About 2 weeks went by without hearing anything about Mike and Lisa, until one day my mom was in her aerobics class with her friends and she talked about it with her friends. One of them knew Lisa and Mike well and told my mom that it gave her the creeps. Turns out that lady had heard rumors that they had started messing around with satanic worship stuff at their house, which was right next door to ours. No one knew where they had gone, and honestly I didn't care. Did I quote, "I'll never forget the way Mike looked at me through that peephole." Last year I graduated from high school and moved to a bigger city. Truth be told, I feel safer here, but I will always be left with the question of what the hell happened to Mike and Lisa. Maybe someday I will find out, or maybe I won't.